By sunrise on Monday, 11 bodies lay along a 2-mile strip locals call Montana Street. And every deputy in Harlan Fork knew one thing for sure. This was no accident. Eli Dalton had given himself a single weekend to stop his father's stolen whiskey recipe from riding those trucks clear out of the mountains. If he failed, his family name would be cheap liquor on a shelf in towns that never heard of the Daltons. If he succeeded, the price would be written in blood and court files. When the sirens faded, all that was left was a battered 1968 Chevy pickup with a fresh scrape in the paint, shotgun shells in the dust, and a town split right down the middle over what had just happened. Tonight, we're going back to the summer of 1979, to the Montana Street bloodbath, and the quiet mechanic who turned into a hunter to protect a legacy. Before we start, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? To understand that Monday morning, you have to see Harlan Fork the year before the blood. The town sat in a fold of the mountains, coal tipples rusting, company houses peeling, and a new kind of traffic rolling past that never stopped to stay. Diesel rigs came down out of the pass, air brakes hissing, then slid along a narrow strip of asphalt folks called Montana Street. On that strip, money still moved. Bars, motels, a tire shop, a crowded diner, and Eli Dalton's small garage lined the road like teeth. Coal checks had shrunk. Pensions vanished when old outfits folded. People did what they had to do. Cash jobs, unreported repairs, and jars traded from hand to hand filled gaps that city men with clipboards never saw. Law on paper came from far away. Law that counted came from front porches, holler churches, and men who remembered who helped them when mines flooded or roofs fell. Up there, a promise meant more than a signature. A recipe passed from a dying father meant more than any deed. Montana Street became the town's throat. Truckers needed fuel, food, and something stronger in their coffee. Locals needed that money. Back out of more than one business, quiet deals kept everybody afloat. Clear liquor in unmarked jars passed through shadows, slipped under seats, tucked into toolboxes. By the late 1970s, that back-road whiskey wasn't just a side hustle. It had turned into one of the only steady streams left. For men like Elias Dalton and Vernon Clay, that stream was life itself. It was history, pride, and the last thin line between keeping land or handing it to the bank. Years later, when agents traced routes and read old ledgers, they would see how tight that world had become. Coal slumped, factories closed, and big chain stores sat miles away on flatter ground. Harlan Fork's people learned to lean on one another and on trades that never appeared in tax files. Against that pressure, stealing a whiskey recipe was not just business. Up there, it was like cutting your neighbor's family name off his own mailbox. When one man took another man's craft and sold it to outsiders rolling across Montana Street, it felt like an eraser dragging across a whole bloodline. That is the storm building under the quiet scenes. Trucks humming at night, neon beer signs buzzing, a mechanic wiping his hands on a rag, watching plates from far states roll by. A partner counting crumpled bills in a back room, already planning to grow bigger than the hills that raised him. The Monday when 11 bodies lay in the dust did not come from nowhere. It rose slow, year after year, along a road built to move things out of the mountains and never bring much back. Long before he picked up a rifle, Elias Dalton in Semt spent his days with wrenches and grease. His garage sat close to the bend where Montana Street started to climb toward the pass. 2 service bays, a faded sign, and that old 1968 Chevy pickup out front, made up most of what strangers ever saw. Inside, things were quieter. Elias moved with the slow care of a man who knew metal could kill you if you rushed it. He listened more than he spoke. Truckers liked that. They could gripe about dispatchers, wives, or pay, while Elias checked bearings and listened for bad sounds in the engine. He rarely offered advice. He just did solid work and took cash. At home, his hands softened when he held the old recipe book. It wasn't really a book, just pages his father had written in pencil and tucked inside a Bible. Ratio of corn to rye, yeast tricks, cooling times, notes on how to read the sound of a run, not just the temp. Those scribbles were passed to Elias the week his daddy started coughing blood. In the evenings, after the garage closed, Elias sat at the kitchen table with that bundle of pages and a neat spiral notebook beside them. He copied small parts, then stopped, not willing to write too much in one place. On the next page, he kept records of old shine runs from the years when he still cooked. Dates, jars, buyers. It was habit now, even though he'd pulled his still down when Jesse was born. Ledgers came easy to him. War did that. In Vietnam, he'd seen what happened when units lost track of supplies and men. Details meant survival. After he came home, he carried that same care into moonshine, then into repairs. Every fuel filter change, every tire swap, every jar of clear liquor once had a line in his books. Ruth, his wife, watched him write, but didn't ask much. She knew the recipe meant more than extra cash. To Elias, it was proof his people had made something worth handing down. Caleb and Jesse grew up hearing that talk, not in big speeches, in short lines said while checking fence or splitting wood. "This is all I got to leave you," Elias would mutter, more to himself than them. That quiet pride sat in him like a stone. Outside, trucks rolled by loaded with coal for other men's gain. Inside, he held a secret passed from his father's shaking hands. When that secret walked off his land and into someone else's pocket, all that stone weight would crack. For now, life moved on in small circles: garage, home, Sunday church, and the little rituals that kept the Dalton legacy alive, if only inside one man's chest and one worn notebook. While Eli kept to his bay and his books, Vernon Clay grew restless. Vernon had stood beside Eli at old still sites years before, sweating under moonlight, learning each step like a younger brother. He joked loud, told long stories, and always had some small scheme brewing. Folks liked him, mostly. They said he was good company, which in those hills covered a lot of sins. Time pressed harder on Vernon than he let on. 2 sons to feed, another baby that hadn't made it, a wife who watched grocery prices climb while coal checks thinned. Bill envelopes stacked on the table faster than cash came in. The shine he cooked with Eli on and off never felt like enough. At some point, he stopped seeing the Dalton recipe as sacred and began seeing it as trapped value. Why should it live in one family, he asked himself, when it could do so much more for his own? In his mind, taking it wasn't theft, it was opening it up, making it work. He paid close attention during those last joint runs with Eli. Heat levels, cuts, the way Eli could tell when to switch jars without even checking a thermometer. He watched. Then one night he watched the recipe pages too, when Eli stepped outside to deal with a noise in the yard. It only took a glance to fix the key numbers in his memory. Soon after, Vernon built his own still deeper up a side hollow. Not the old way, with hidden stones and creek water, but with plastic drums and cheap sheet metal, easier to break down if lawmen got close. He bought corn on credit. He sent Ricky and Daryl to scout motels and bars along Montana Street, where truckers stopped regular. The first batch that came off Vernon's new rig tasted close enough, harsh on the back end, but strong, clear, and close to what he knew Eli once made. He called it Clay Mountain White when he spoke to his boys, but to truckers he bragged it was Dalton style. That name carried weight. It moved jars. Those jars started turning up far from Eli's hands. A hauler passing through the garage would leave one by mistake in the cab. A motel owner would slip a jar to a regular and mention Vernon's new stuff. Eli noticed. He knew his own work even when someone else poured it. What hurt wasn't just the taste, it was the lie. Vernon told buyers he'd improved an old way, that he'd come up with his own twist out of thin air. In bar talk and truck stop corners, men started repeating that story. One by one, years of quiet Dalton pride slipped from Eli's bloodline to Vernon's mouth. Later, in court, Vernon would say he only did what any man would do to keep his family fed. But in those first months, before papers and charges, what he really did was cross a line older than either of them. He took another man's inheritance and sold it by the jar to strangers rolling down Montana Street. Once Eli understood what Vernon had done, he did not shout. He watched. He listened. Rage in those hills often comes slow and cold, not hot and wild. He started by checking trucks he worked on. Now and then, when a driver walked to the diner, Eli would glance in the cab. He wasn't looking for guns or dope. He hunted for glass. When he found a jar, he lifted it to the light. The cut, the smell, the way it clung to the glass told him more than any label. At first, he hoped he was wrong. Maybe Vernon had changed enough steps that it wasn't the same. Then he saw the little habit only Eli used, a tiny chip on the lip of certain jars so he could track batches. That chip sat under a trucker's seat one afternoon, miles from where Eli had last cooked. There was no doubt after that. He tried going through proper doors. He spoke to a local lawyer who mostly handled wills. The man listened, then asked if Eli had ever patented anything or if there were written agreements. Eli felt foolish in that office chair. How could he explain that what mattered here was a promise in a graveyard and a code older than court stamps? The lawyer told him there wasn't much law could do about a way of doing something. Maybe, he said, Eli could let it go or join Vernon and make more money. That answer sat wrong down to Eli's bones. Next, he went to the sheriff. The talk was shorter. The sheriff knew about Shine, knew about Montana Street, and knew better than to open that can without backing. Eli's complaint landed on a desk stacked with burglaries, bar fights, and a bad check pile. A stolen recipe didn't stand a chance. Walking home from that office, Eli felt something shift. In his head, he had carried two hopes, that law might step in or that Vernon might see reason if someone with a badge spoke to him. Both hopes died that day. All that stood between the Daltons and erasure now was Eli himself. That night, he pulled out a fresh notebook. On the first page, he wrote a date, then one simple line: men tied to stolen Dalton recipe. Under it, he started a list. Names of truckers he knew were hauling Vernon's jars, motel owners who bragged about their special stock, middlemen who took cases off Ricky's pickup behind the diner. He added notes where he could, license plates, usual stopping spots, times of day they rolled in. He wasn't sure yet what he meant to do with this information. He only knew that if no court would see the wrong, then he would, and he would not trust memory alone. That book became the first part of the engine that would drive everything after. A quiet choice, made under a single kitchen light while Ruth slept and the boys dreamed, pointed Eli away from patience and toward a road he could not leave once he stepped on it. Summer heat pressed down on Montana Street when the small thing happened that history would blame. Eli had closed the garage for the evening. His old Chevy pickup, washed that afternoon by Jesse as a kind of offering, sat out front. Sun slid low. Neon at the bar down the road flickered on. A long-haul rig eased into the gravel lot outside that bar. The trailer swung wider than it should have. Metal scraped metal. Eli heard it from his doorway. That sound, sharp and raw, turned heads up and down the strip. When dust settled, a fresh white streak ran along the side of Eli's truck. The driver climbed down, saw the damage, and laughed it off. Folks nearby watched Eli step closer, jaw tight, words short. To them, it looked like a man sore about his paint. To Eli, it felt like one more proof that his name, his work, his pride meant nothing to these pass-through men who drank his stolen legacy. That driver, Lou Kansas Mercer, had 2 crates in his trailer. Clear jars, strong liquor, Vernon's liquor. Eli recognized the cases when the back doors opened later as men loaded them off by the bar's kitchen. He followed at a distance, heart beating slow and steady, mind clicking like a ratchet. Long after jokes about the dent died out and most of the crowd stumbled home, Kansas took his truck back on the road. Out past the last neon, where trees closed over and the road narrowed, a single set of headlights pulled in behind him and flashed. Kansas eased onto a gravel pull-off, thinking it was just another driver needing a word. By dawn, deputies found him slumped over his wheel, chest dark, windshield starred. On the ground below, spent shells lay beside 2 broken jars. Those glass shards smelled like Eli's stolen past. A folded slip of paper sat on the dash, tucked under Kansas's cigarettes. It listed 3 names and a rough sketch of arrows between them. Kansas, Vernon, Dalton. Nobody on that patrol understood it yet. Back in town, Eli wrote another line in his notebook. He added Kansas's name, the date, and a short note about the scrape and the laugh. One line under that, in tighter script, he wrote where Kansas usually fueled, where he slept, where he picked up Vernon's deliveries. It was all there, pinned like a bug to the page. To neighbors, it was a tragedy on the road, maybe tied to a deal gone wrong. To Eli, it was first blood in a hunt he felt forced into. The scratched truck was only the visible spark. The real fire had been burning ever since Vernon sold the Dalton name up and down Montana Street for his own gain. News of Kansas's death spread fast along the strip. Rumors ran even faster. Some said he owed cash. Others blamed jealous lovers or out-of-state dope men. Few looked toward the quiet garage at first. Eli changed oil, rotated tires, and kept his head down like always. Inside, his mind moved ahead. The list in his notebook was more than ink now. It had 1 name crossed by fate, 10 more waiting. At the top of that stack sat Vernon's own blood, Ricky Clay. Ricky ran loads for his father, hauling jars tucked into toolboxes and behind seatbacks, laughing with other haulers about Dalton-style white. Eli knew Ricky's patterns. The young man stopped at a certain truck stop out on the edge of the county, away from Montana Street's lights. There he topped off his tank, traded gossip, and sometimes moved cases from Vernon's pickup to other rigs. Cameras were rare. Witnesses didn't ask questions. On a muggy evening not long after Kansas fell, Ricky pulled in as usual. What he didn't see was the old Chevy already parked off to the side, hood up as if it had broken down. Eli sat behind the wheel, waiting, watching mirrors. When Ricky stepped between fuel pumps, a shadow moved. Metal flashed. By the time anyone noticed a body near the back lot, Eli's pickup was rolling away slow and steady, blending into the dark like any other local truck heading home. This killing tore something open in Harlan Fork. Kansas had been an outsider. Ricky was not. He was a clay boy with grandparents who taught Sunday school and cousins on every road. His death was not just a crime scene, it was family news. Vernon howled grief and rage in his yard. Word of that sound climbed the hollers. Investigations saw more this time. In Ricky's glove box they found a jar matching those at Kansas's scene. Same clear shine, same faint chip on the lip, same folded paper, though this one only held initials and a dollar figure. Eli's name did not appear, but the pattern was forming, even if nobody could read it yet. Back at his kitchen table, Eli drew a line through Ricky's name in the notebook. Beside it, he wrote, "Son." Under that, in smaller letters, he added details only a methodical mind would save. Where Ricky met certain haulers, which nights, who paid cash, and who ran tabs. Anyone reading later would see a business, not just a feud. Ruth felt the distance growing in her husband even as he sat under the same roof. He spoke less, he stared longer to nothing. When the phone rang with news of Ricky, she watched Eli's face. No surprise, only that same stone set harder behind his eyes. The cost of his path stepped into view. It wore a familiar last name. It set neighbors on edge. Yet each time Eli looked at his notebook, at the web linking Vernon's theft to these men, he told himself there was no step backward that did not end with the Daltons erased from their own story.
With 2 dead in quick order, fear took a seat at every counter along Montana Street. Bars emptied earlier, motels locked their side doors. Wives told husbands who ran loads for Vernon to quit while they still could. Some listened, many did not. Money in a man's pocket speaks loud when bills pile up. Deputy Morgan Hale felt the tension each time she drove her patrol car past Eli's garage. She'd grown up a few grades behind Caleb Dalton, sat in the same pew rows as Ruth, known Vernon all her life. Now she carried a badge and the weight that came with it. The Kansas and Ricky files sat on her desk, jars, notes, maps. None of it fit normal fights or robberies. One evening, she followed a hunch to a low-budget motel that kept staying in these stories. Several of the dead had paid cash there the nights before they were found. Morgan walked the narrow hall, breathing stale smoke and cheap cleaner, then knocked on a manager's door. Inside that office, she saw a crate of clear jars on a shelf and an old ledger on the desk. Names, room numbers, and small marks beside certain guests. When she asked about it, the manager shrugged, called it just supplies, then quickly offered coffee to change the subject. Morgan left, knowing she had brushed against something larger than a bar fight. Elsewhere that same night, Eli stood in a different motel lot, watching a man he'd marked weeks back. This target had a wife and 2 children waiting upstairs. He saw them, a girl with pigtails, a boy crouched over a toy truck. For a moment, he froze. He'd sworn to himself he'd never harm women or kids. He waited until the man stepped out alone to smoke near the vending machines. There, away from wide eyes, the hunt continued. Another shot in the dark, another jar left as a twisted signature, another note, this one shorter, listing only dates and a simple phrase, bought from Clay. That family woke to sirens and tape. Their lives split into a before and after that did not care about old mountain codes or stolen recipes. Back home, Eli added more entries, more arrows, more lines showing how Vernon's business reached through every body that fell. The notebook thickened.
Each death deepened his belief that if he stopped now, everything already done would have been for nothing. Yet faces of widows and children started to slide between the numbers in his mind. Morgan, looking at her own notes, began to suspect a single hand behind the chaos. Each scene had echoes, same type of liquor, same rough strip of road, same quiet care in how the killer avoided bystanders. It felt personal and planned. It felt like someone older, not a wild kid out for trouble. What neither she nor Eli knew yet was that their paths and that notebook would soon meet. When they did, the killings would stop, but the story would only deepen. As the weekend bled on, the count rose. Deputies worked nearly without sleep. Ambulance crews rolled from one stretch of dark tarmac to another. The sheriff's office pinned photographs to a wall map, red pushpins forming a rough arc along Montana Street and its feeder roads. Eli watched news trickle in from the distance of his garage, which now felt more like a bunker than a workplace. He knew which scenes were his long before radio reports reached the air. Each time a call crackled through dispatch and sirens wailed, he marked a fresh X in his notebook, then closed it like sealing a wound. Only a few names remained uncrossed. At the center of that shrinking circle sat Vernon Clay. Eli knew Vernon would be angry and afraid now, guarding his remaining runners, checking his own back road routes. Cornered men do unpredictable things. Eli could not leave him out there. Before he stepped fully into that final approach, Eli turned his attention to the records that might outlive him. In the quiet of his garage office, with oil stains on the floor and toolboxes lining the walls, he gathered every notebook, scrap, and copied page he had. He sorted them into piles, one tracing Vernon's theft, one linking each dead man to that theft, and a smaller set describing his own actions in plain language. He found an old metal toolbox, the kind nobody looked twice at in a place like that. Into it went the main ledger, the list of names, and a letter addressed to Ruth. On top, he placed an envelope with Deputy Morgan Hale's name in careful print. Inside that, he explained where to look, how to read the notes, and which jars in the evidence room would match his marks. Then he hid that box behind a false panel in the office wall, a trick he'd used years before to stash cash. Only someone searching with a warrant and patience would find it. That was the point. He wanted law, not looters, to uncover it. Once the papers were secure, Eli loaded his truck. Rifle, extra rounds, a small pack with food and water. His movements stayed slow, methodical. No shaking hands, no wild glances. In his mind, this was not a spree. It was the final chapter of a ledger that had to balance. He left the garage bay light on when he drove away. To passing eyes, it looked like he might be coming right back. To him, it marked a line he would not cross again. Out past town, the road to Vernon's hidden still climbed through trees and past narrow drives. The sun had dipped low, shadows lay long. Somewhere up that path, one more man who had shared his father's fire now lived on borrowed time. Before we ride with him into that hollow, if you've stayed with this story so far and want more deep dives into cases like this, consider subscribing. It helps keep these long, hard histories from slipping away. Deputies didn't yet know where Eli had gone when new calls stacked up. Another body in a gravel lot. One more slumped over a steering wheel. Someone found face down by a culvert. Each scene added weight to a county that already felt stretched past its limit. By midday Sunday, the sheriff ordered all active cases laid out in one room. Morgan Hale and two other deputies pinned maps, lined up photos, and spread reports across a long table in the back of the small brick building that passed for a war room. Coffee went cold faster than they could drink it. Patterns jumped out once they stopped chasing each scene by itself. Most victims worked freight, ran shine, or supplied places along Montana Street. Almost all had some tie, however thin, to Vernon clay. Empty jars matching each other turned up in trash bins, truck cabs, even one roadside ditch. Chips on the rims matched. Notes at several scenes, though cryptic, repeated names. Kansas, Ricky. Initials that matched motel owners, payment numbers. Drawn arrows showing flow from one man to another. Morgan traced a finger from dot to dot on the map and found that many lines crossed near Eli's garage. It sat in the center like a calm eye in a spinning storm. She did not yet say his name out loud, but it came to her mind with a chill. While they connected those dots, up in a wooded hollow, another dot was falling. No one saw the last meeting between Eli and Vernon. They only saw what remained after. A tip from a distant holler boy who heard shots sent lawmen up a narrow, rutted road. There, beside a crude still site half hidden under branches, Vernon lay among spilled mash and shattered glass. Spent casings nearby matched others already bagged. A jar, unbroken this time, sat on a stump. On its side, in permanent marker, someone had written 2 words: Dalton's last. This final death changed the question for investigators. Before Vernon, they had been looking for a killer who might be attacking truckers and drifters. Now the web circled back to a hometown name. They had a dead local bootlegger at a secret still, his son gone, his network cut up along the road. Morgan and the sheriff drove back from the hollow in grim silence. On the ride, Morgan thought again of Eli's stiff shoulders when she'd seen him fill out a complaint weeks earlier about a theft that law won't touch. She thought of Ruth at church, quieter than usual. She thought of Caleb standing outside the garage with a look that said more than his mouth ever did. By the time they reached the office, deputies were already whispering a theory. Someone close to the Shine world had lost patience. Someone with old-school ideas about honor had decided to do what the law would not. Every step they took from that moment on drew them closer to Eli's hidden box of papers, even though they did not know it existed. The bodies along Montana Street were no longer random marks. They were stepping stones leading to a single door. A judge's signature on a plain sheet of paper opened that door. With Vernon gone and the death toll at 11, the sheriff sought warrants for searches tied to known players in the Shine trade. Eli's garage made the list. The judge, who had once hunted with Eli's father, hesitated, then signed anyway. Blood left little room for old favors. Morgan drove to the garage with 2 other deputies. The bay doors were shut, but not locked. Inside, tools sat in place. An oily rag lay across a workbench. It felt like someone had just stepped out for a moment. Sun slanted through dusty windows, turning air into gold streaks. They moved through each room like they might spook something. In the office, Morgan's eyes caught a faint line along one wall where paneling didn't meet clean. Years of working around old houses taught her what that meant. She pressed, then pulled. A section of wall swung inward. Behind it sat the metal toolbox. Her heart thudded. Part of her wanted to back away, call the sheriff, and let someone else lift the lid. Another part, the one that had chosen the badge, told her this was why she wore it. After a moment's pause, she flipped the latches. Inside lay neat stacks of notebooks, loose pages, and 2 envelopes labeled in Eli's block print. One bore Ruth's name, the other carried her own. Morgan swallowed hard and opened the one meant for her. The letter inside was short. Eli wrote that if she was reading it, then things have gone the way they had to. He explained that the notebooks mapped Vernon's theft of the Dalton recipe, the routes used, the payments made, and the men who died along Montana Street. He admitted, without excuse or flourish, that he had killed them. He asked only that the record he had built be seen, not just the bodies. Flipping through the ledgers, Morgan saw detail that stunned her. Dates of meetings, quantities of jars, notes on license plates and states, hand-drawn lines between Vernon, his sons, motel owners, and haulers from far away. Each dead man's name was there, along with several more who had not yet fallen. Eli's notes did not clear him, they damned him. But they also laid bare a network of untaxed liquor, false filings, and income the government had never touched. Taxmen and federal agents would salivate over this. Morgan carried the box out like it was a live thing. At the sheriff's office, they made copies, then called County Attorney Harold Baines. He read, rubbing his forehead, already seeing not just murder charges, but possible federal cases. He reached for a different phone and contacted the nearest alcohol, tobacco, and firearms office. Within hours, what had been a county hunt for a single killer opened into a broader inquiry. Eli, through that paper trail, had turned his private war into something no larger system could ignore.
As word slipped into public ears that feds were sniffing around shine roots, Harlan Fork's mood shifted again. Fear of one hunter on back roads turned into a deeper worry about outside eyes looking into every side deal and cash job along Montana Street. At the diner, where men once joked about Clay Mountain White, voices dropped. Folks leaned closer over coffee, speaking names only in half whispers. Some called Eli a monster. They pointed at the widows, at Vernon's grieving wife, at Ricky's empty seat at ball games. Others, lower still, said he'd done what many had only talked about whenever news came that another local craft had been stolen and sold cheap by big outfits. The church crowd wrestled with it hardest. Preachers preached on vengeance and justice, on leaving wrath to God. Sitting in wooden pews, people who'd buried brothers in mine blasts caused by distant company neglect felt that message rub against years of pain. The line between law and honor looked thinner now, traced in fresh graves. Families of the dead faced a double burden. They'd lost sons, husbands, fathers. Now they heard their loved ones' names tied to illegal runs, tax dodging, and a stolen recipe they didn't even know existed. Some accepted the truth and wept harder. Others rejected it outright, insisting their men had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that Eli's notebooks were lies to justify killing. In back rooms, older mountain folk spoke of old ways that said you didn't steal a man's legacy and expect to sleep easy. Stories from their grandparents' time about feuds and long-running grudges resurfaced in quiet talk. People compared Eli to names whispered from the Hatfield-McCoy days, both scorned and half admired. Newspaper columns tried to make sense of it. One week, an editorial called Eli's acts the work of a deluded vigilante. The next, a letter from a coal widow asked why nobody cared this much when companies cheated safety rules and men died without anybody going to prison. Pain in that county did not start with one weekend. Eli's spree just tore the cover off old wounds. For Morgan, sitting at her desk with copies of Eli's ledgers and ATF memos piling up, the debate felt personal. She'd chosen duty. She'd also grown up under the same hills and codes that shaped both Eli and Vernon. Every arrest she made in that case would please some neighbors and anger others. Every step the government took based on Eli's papers would be seen by some as cleaning up crime and by others as punishing survival. In that tension, the paper trail did exactly what Eli must have sensed it would. It forced everyone, from local folks to federal lawyers, to face not only what he'd done, but why he felt pushed so far. Agents and deputies found Eli before he made any move to run. He was at an old family place, a small patch of land where his father had once kept hogs. The rifle leaned against the porch rail. His hands rested on his knees. When Morgan stepped from the cruiser, he raised his eyes but not his voice. They approached with care, weapons drawn, hearts pounding harder than they let show. In scenes like this, one twitch can crack everything wide open. Eli simply stood when told, turned, and let cuffs bite his wrists. There was no chase, no last stand. He had already made his stand on Montana Street. On the ride back to town, fields blurred past. Morgan watched his reflection in the glass. No triumph, no clear regret, just a tired man whose choices had finally met their end. She thought about the envelope he'd written her, the trust tucked into those pages, and felt a mix of anger and unwanted respect. At the jail, after the booking process left fingerprints and a mugshot on record forever, Eli asked to speak with investigators. He did not ask for a lawyer. County Attorney Baines, Morgan, the sheriff, and a pair of ATF agents sat across from him in a cramped interview room. Eli spoke in the same plain tone he used when explaining an engine knock. He admitted to each killing, named each man, described each scene. He tied every death back to Vernon's theft of the Dalton recipe and to specific deals laid out in his notebooks. When asked why he wrote so much down, he said he wanted people to see the whole picture, not just the blood. The agents listened close when he walked them through the wider scheme. Unreported income, false claims on fuel, jars moved across state lines in hidden spaces. Their questions shifted from "Why did you shoot?" to "Who else bought from Clay?" and "Where did the cash go?" Eli answered, never once softening what he had done. This was the power reversal. Up until that moment, Vernon and his network had used the shadows and gaps in law to profit off a stolen legacy. Now, with Eli in chains, the same system they dodged turned its gaze on them. His paper trail became a roadmap for cases that reached beyond any one hollow. For Eli, there was no victory in the usual sense. He sat cuffed, facing certain life behind bars or worse. Yet on one level, his goal had been reached. The theft of the Dalton recipe could not be brushed aside as rumor. It sat in official statements and federal notes. When people spoke of the Montana Street bloodbath, they could not skip over why it began. Outside that room, Montana Street carried on. Trucks rolled. Neighbors peeked over curtains when cruisers passed. A community that once thought it understood its own rules now saw just how sharp they could become when one man took them farther than most dared. Months later, people lined the courthouse steps in Harlan Fork for Eli Dalton's trial. Some came for justice, others for a story to tell. A few came because they'd known his father and could not square that memory with the man now let up in shackles. Inside, the air felt close. Reporters scratched notes. Families of the dead filled benches on one side. Ruth and her boys sat on the other, eyes fixed on a man they loved but no longer fully knew. The prosecution laid out the killings with clinical care. Photographs, ballistics reports, timelines, witness testimony about last sightings on Montana Street. They painted Eli as a calculating murderer who used honor talk as cover. When they held up his notebooks, they called them trophy logs, grim records of a man savoring his own power. The defense, a court-appointed attorney who'd walked these hills himself, told a harder story. He did not deny the deaths. Instead, he used those same notebooks as a window into a different wrong. He called ATF agents and state taxmen to the stand, who confirmed that Vernon Clay and his partners had built a sizable illegal liquor and tax evasion operation using a method traced back to Eli's father. Claire Donnelly, a regional reporter, watched as line after line from Eli's notes entered the record. She noted how often the words stolen and legacy appeared. To readers far away, it might sound like pride gone mad. The locals, it echoed things they'd felt when coal companies closed without paying pensions,
or when out-of-state investors took over land their grandparents had cleared. In the end, the jury saw no legal excuse for 11 dead men. They found Eli guilty on multiple counts of murder. The judge, voice steady, handed down consecutive life sentences, making sure Eli would leave prison only in a box. As gasps and muffled sobs rippled through the room, Ruth gripped Jesse's hand until his knuckles paled. Yet sentence day also brought other papers. Thanks to Eli's ledgers and the follow-up work they sparked, indictments dropped on several remaining members of Vernon's network. Motel owners, middlemen, even a distant cousin who handled cash faced charges for bootlegging, tax fraud, and conspiracy. Their cases would not draw as much attention as Eli's, but their names would sit beside his in the same court books. That dual outcome marked the strange heart of this story. The system punished the man who took lives to defend a legacy. At the same time, it finally reached out to touch those who had stolen that legacy under cover of just business. The law moved on both fronts because one methodical mechanic built a paper bridge it could not ignore. When the judge's gavel fell for the last time, Montana Street didn't get closure. It got a verdict. Prison life wore on Eli Dalton like steady rain on soft rock. He went from a county cell to a state facility hours away, concrete replacing mountains, razor wire standing where trees once did. Gates clanged shut behind him, echoing louder than any rifle report he had ever heard. In that world, his name meant little. Guards saw another lifer. Inmates saw a quiet older man with scars and a stare that drifted toward distance. Only a few, those who read newspapers or heard from kin back home, knew they were walking beside the man from Montana Street. To them, they were either a legend or a fool, depending on who told the tale. Eli spent his days in routine. Chow line, work detail, yard time, lockdown. He fixed things when asked, broken radios, loose chair legs, the small machines that clatter in prison laundries. His hands still knew metal. His mind still moved in careful lines. He did not keep new ledgers. The old habit tempted him, but he refused. The only record that mattered now sat in court files and news clippings. He wrote letters instead, short ones to Ruth and the boys. He never once asked for pity. He spoke of weather, of books he borrowed from the chapel shelf, of memories before any of this. News reached him in pieces. A cousin's note saying one motel owner took a plea deal, a clipping about another Clay relative losing property to fines, an article Claire Donnelly mailed, tucked between lines of her own, explaining how the state used his ledgers to tighten liquor laws and step up rural tax enforcement. Each time Eli read about those outcomes, he felt a dull, tangled feeling. Part of him was grimly pleased that the theft had cost those men more than a scolding. Part of him could not escape the thought that there might have been some other path to that same end without 11 graves. The recipe stayed in his head. He never wrote it down, despite offers from other inmates who suggested he could make money sharing it with folks waiting on the outside. Eli turned them away with a look that ended talk. That method, those ratios, belonged to ghosts now. Caleb visited a few times, sitting across a metal table while guards watched. Jesse came once, then no more. The distance and the sight of his father in chains rattled him in ways words could not fix. Ruth aged faster than Eli remembered her from the kitchen table years. Each visit drew lines deeper into her face. As seasons turned over concrete yards instead of cornfields, Eli understood that his legacy had split. One part lived in stories locals told, some angry, some admiring, almost all uneasy. Another part lived in legal records that would outlast everyone in that prison. The recipe, the craft he'd tried to defend, lived only in his fading mind, where even he sometimes wished it would go quiet.
He had forced his story into history. He could not choose how later mouths would tell it. Outside the fences, time did not heal so much as rearrange. Families of the dead tried to build lives around empty chairs. Some moved closer together, others shattered under the weight of blame and shame. Vernon's widow, Leela, spent years caught between rage at Eli and quiet anger at her husband. Court records showed things she had never known: secret accounts, lies about income, risks he'd taken with their sons' futures. Grief for Ricky and Daryl sat beside a hard truth that the path Vernon chose helped lay the ground for their deaths. In private, she wept. In public, she rarely spoke his name. Children of the truckers killed on Montana Street grew up with half-told stories. Some were told their fathers were innocent victims of a madman. Others heard whispers about running wet goods and taking chances. At school, when lessons touched on crime or Appalachia, a few turned their eyes to the floor, not wanting classmates to connect dates and places. In the Dalton house, Ruth carried on in a kind of steady daze. Bills still came, groceries still had to be bought. She took part-time work at the diner, then full-time when Jesse's health tossed a few more hurdles onto their path. People watched her with mixed looks: sympathy, judgment, quiet curiosity about how a woman sleeps knowing her husband sits in a cell for what many considered butchery. Caleb shouldered more than most his age. He fixed cars in the same bay where his father once worked, though the sign above the door now read something else under a new owner. Some nights, when tools rattled in his hands, customers saw Eli's posture in his shoulders and looked away. The name Dalton drew longer shadows. Some folks refused to speak it. Others used it in warnings, the way parents once used tales of old feuds. "Don't cross me. Remember what happened when they stole from Eli." That twisted legacy rested heavy on Caleb and Jesse. They did not ask for it, yet it came with every mail envelope and every sideways glance. Victim families formed quiet bonds. A few met at church gatherings or support groups. They shared stories of men who'd once been more than victim number 6. They spoke about little things: how one laughed, how another hated onions, how a third sang loudly off-key. Those memories did what no verdict could. They made the dead whole again. In those circles, talk of recipes and codes surfaced sometimes. Some found a sliver of peace in knowing there was a reason, however warped, behind the shootings. Others rejected that idea as poison. To them, the theft of a legacy, real or not, could never stand beside the taking of a life. The paper trail that Eli built reached into these homes mainly through folded clippings and stories retold. No document could mend their loss. It only fixed blame in ink, leaving living hearts to carry weight that never made it into any ledger. Years rolled over Harlan Fork like fog that never quite lifted. Montana Street changed its skin but not its bones. Some of the old bars closed, their signs left to rust. A chain gas station with bright lights and uniform pumps rose where Eli's garage once stood, offering pay at the pump ease instead of a nod from a neighbor. Coal never came back the way old men hoped. Another wave of layoffs hit in the late 80s. Younger folks left for cities, chasing work in factories or offices. Those who stayed faced a new scourge: pills, then meth, drifting in on the same roads that once carried clear jars. Town leaders, stung by the Dalton case and the bad press that followed, tried small fixes. A local history group held talks about our past, our future, where they mentioned moonshine alongside railroads and mines. A grant funded a tiny legal craft distillery down the road, meant to turn old knowledge into above-board business. It barely held on. Laws tightened around backwoods liquor, but enforcement waxed and waned as budgets shifted. Some folks muttered that the government only cared when tax money slipped away, not when families went hungry. That view, as old as the hills themselves, did not die with Eli's trial. Montana Street's role as a throat for the town remained. Now, instead of jars tucked under seats, pills changed hands in murky corners. Police reports listed overdoses where once they had listed bar fights. The tools of harm updated. The wounds looked hauntingly familiar. Yet echoes of the older story hung on. When new business owners looked to buy property along the Strip, they asked about that thing that happened back then. Realtors fed them softened versions. Yes, there was trouble, but it's calm now. Teens, hearing scraps from grandparents, took to websites and message boards, trying to piece together what really went on that bloody weekend. Claire Donnelly, older now, did a follow-up feature for a regional magazine on the case's 20th anniversary. She walked the same stretch of asphalt, noting what had changed and what still felt exactly the same. In her piece, she argued that Montana Street shows how economic desperation, cultural pride, and neglect from higher powers can twist together until one man's choice explodes into community trauma. Town council minutes from those years reveal a tug-of-war between wanting to move past the Dalton name and knowing they couldn't scrub it out without lying to themselves. Some proposed a memorial for all lives lost to events of 1979. Others said that would glorify a killer. In the end, no official marker went up. Memories stayed scattered, a story told over coffee, a warning muttered to a hot-headed youth, a line in a school paper about local history. The system the paper trail had awakened carried on with its own logic. New cases filled dockets. New names took up lines where Daltons and Clays once sat. Underneath, the same old questions hummed, waiting for another hard season to bring them to the surface. Looking back now, from a distance of decades, the Montana Street bloodbath sits at a crossroads of two kinds of law. On one side stands the written code, statutes, regulations, tax rules, liquor licenses. On the other stands the unwritten one, promises made at gravesides, family honor, the belief that some things belong so deeply to your people that no court can touch that claim. Eli Dalton lived deep in that second world. So did Vernon Clay, at least until money needs pulled him across a line. When Vernon took the Dalton recipe and spread it through truckers without so much as a word of thanks or a share, he broke more than a handshake agreement. In Eli's mind, he erased ancestors. The trouble is, unwritten law gives no clear stopping point. Once Eli decided that formal systems would not defend his legacy, each step he took felt, to him, like the only step left. Kansas laughed at the scratched truck? That became proof of wider disrespect. Ricky hauled jars with a grin? That made him part of the theft. Paper in a notebook turned into sights aligned on flesh. His paper trail engine shows the strange overlap between honor and bureaucracy. He wanted his pain on record. He wanted future eyes, maybe yours today, to see how his father's craft, born in hard times and passed with shaking hands, ended up in someone else's pocket. To do that, he used the very tools of the system he distrusted: dates, names, routes, signatures. The state used that same trail to do what it knows best: prosecute, fine, imprison. Thieves of legacy faced charges, so did the man who enforced his own verdict with bullets. Justice, in the official sense, checked its boxes. Yet, in Harlan Fork's kitchens and on porches, folks still ask if anything truly changed. Coal towns remain at the mercy of markets far away. Crafts and stories still walk off in the pockets of people with more reach and better lawyers. Men and women who feel invisible still wonder if anyone will ever hear them without some terrible act forcing attention.
Violence, like Eli's, does not fix those gaps. It deepens them. Every grave on Montana Street proves that. At the same time, the case warns against simple answers. To call him just a monster lets everyone else off the hook. The partner who stole, the companies that left towns to rot, the officials who shrugged when a man tried to protect the only inheritance he had. So we come to a hard question. When systems leave whole regions feeling written out of their own story, what grows in that empty space? And how do we stop that growth from blooming again into blood?
Today, if you drive through that part of the mountains and roll along the road locals still call Montana Street, you might not notice anything unusual. The chain station pumps gas. A fast food place hums where a bar once stood. Motels have new paint and new names. Trucks whisper past on smoother asphalt than Eli ever knew. Look closer, and you'll see small ghosts. A faint scar in the curb where a bumper once hit. An older man staring a little too long as a rig from out of state idles. A tiny cross hammered into the ground near a bend. Plastic flowers faded by seasons. Ask the right person in the right booth at the diner, and they'll point with their chin down the strip and say, "That's where it happened." They might tell you about Eli and Vernon, about a recipe passed from father to son, about a scratched pickup and a weekend when honor and hurt boiled over into 11 deaths. They might also tell you how the papers Eli left behind drug agents to town, dragged hidden deals into the light, and stamped names into books that will sit on courthouse shelves long after every grave here has sunk flat. In that way, his paper trail did what he meant it to do. It forced the wider world to see a story that might have stayed rumor. Whether that cost was worth it is something no jury answered. As you listen, maybe from a long way off through this screen, I want to leave you with the question that hangs over every mile of that road. If someone stole the only thing your family ever had to pass down, a craft, a name, a story, and no one in power cared, how far would you go to defend it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more deep, honest looks at cases like this, where law, legacy, and blood collide, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next story.